So now today we are going to move to labor market essentially, right? So here's the title is called business cycle, unemployment, inflation. So we are going to look at two things. One is looking at labor market, and on the other hand, so we're going to look at inflation. As you're going to see, once we unfold this chapter, you're going to see, so there's some very interesting and intrinsic correlation between unemployment and inflation. Again, right now is a perfect time to understand this. What happening right now in the broader economy? So we have high inflation. At the same time, the unemployment rate is historically low. Okay, if you ever pay attention to the news, the central bank, so they are trying their best to fight the inflation. And then they say they are not going to stop until they see some compelling evidence we are doing well. Right. So, but then, so what does that mean? Okay, when they say we not stop until we see compelling evidence, and usually it not only means they see the inflation starts to winding down, and at the same time, usually they are going to see the cooling in labor market. So these two things usually they are watched closely, but before we start, or before we read this chapter, you may just wondering why these two things are closely related. So that's what we are trying to achieve in this chapter, or maybe in the later chapter. But at the beginning, so you need to understand how we measure in these two. All right. So here is the roadmap of this chapter. So essentially, there's two parts. One is regarding to the labor market. Okay. We are focused on unemployment rate. The other is price level. We are going to focus on inflation, right? So unemployment and inflation, right? Okay. Like I said, okay, so these two things play a central role in the policy making. And more specifically, so the chair of the Federal Reserve. Again, so what is Federal Reserve? So that's a central bank. What is central bank? Essentially, is the bank of the bank, right? So the current chairperson is Jerome, or they call him Jay Powell. Okay, his main goal is trying to strike a balance between two things. Since number one is a need for workers, and the other one is a need for price stability. What would you think is the need of workers? What workers need? What worker need? Money. Yeah, where money coming from? So this is market economy. Sorry, employer. Meaning, so essentially just means that's correct, right? So money coming from employer. So that essentially just says the need of worker is jobs, right? So one hand, so they need to satisfy the need of workers, jobs, or low unemployment, as we're going to see later. On the other hand, what's the need for price stability? What does that mean? Price stability means so price doesn't fluctuate too much. Like currently we see inflation, means price rise, right? Historical price can decline. Okay, so this fluctuation, as we're going to see later, so either rising too fast or falling too fast, they are bad to the economy, right? Okay, so that's kind of the two things. So the Fed need to balance. But at the moment, so you may wondering why these two are correlated. So that's the thing we need to study. But before we understand their intrinsic correlation, first we need to understand how they come up numbers. The numbers in terms of measuring the labor market and in terms of measuring the price. Okay, so that's kind of the key things we're going to discuss. So first, look at some data. So this is unemployment rate. You don't know that yet, but this is what we're going to study. Okay, so we have data from 1948 to 2014. Okay. Even though we look at up to today, more or less similar. I mean, in terms of the overall patterns, in terms of the overall stylized facts, it's the same. If we just staring at this graph, you're going to see the following things. Number one, I think the most compelling things we can see from this graph is what? It fluctuates, right? So number one, it fluctuates. Let me write down. Number one, fluctuate. Number two, in terms of fluctuation, it peaks. When it peaks, usually we have this shade. But you may wondering what are those shades? Okay, so actually those are business cycle or recession, right? Okay, so what is recession? So we talked about that briefly earlier, but in this class and in the following class, we are going to give you more details what that means and what we can do. Okay, but essentially recession means the economy is slowing down, is in a contraction. Just think about you drive in a car on the highway. So there's accident or there's a bad weather. Usually you must slow it down, right? If you drive to in the middle of Nebraska and you're going to speed enough, right? If you drive to north, if you ever travel to North Dakota, and you probably know their speed limit is 80, so you're going to speed up. So that's kind of expansion. Does it make sense? Once you get into downtown, you're slowing down. So similar for the economy, right? So the second, so unemployment rate rise in recession, right? So number three, the third thing you should pay attention or you should notice is that this number never fall below a positive number. Or in other words, it's always above something. All right, never ever close to zero. So now this kind of not in line with what we discussed earlier in terms of market equilibrium, right? Because remember when we talk about when in the microeconomics, when we talk about supply and demand, usually there's invisible hands, and the invisible hands is going to lead to market clearing. If there's a market clearing in labor market, literally, what does that mean in terms of unemployment? Yes, I knew, so we haven't talked about unemployment yet. It essentially just says there's a certain number of people don't have a job. So if the invisible hand really works as it should be, what would you expect the unemployment will look like in the long run? What do you think? Zero or not zero? Is zero or not zero? Why? Right, so that's the data told us. But I was asking you, in theory, if the invisible hand, as we discussed earlier, works as it should be, and what would be the unemployment rate? Is we were zero, right? So if there's unemployment and then people willing to work for lower price, market must clear. But unfortunately, it never happens. Okay, this is something you need to always keep in mind. In reality, in the labor market, unemployment rate never close to zero. And usually, so the lower bound is 4%. But what it is per 4%, as we are going to study later, this is what we call the frictional unemployment. What is frictional unemployment? So I'll give you a preview. It just essentially means in reality, we are not living a perfect world. Okay, there's a friction. Like in the physical world, if there's no friction, if someone push me, I'm going to keep moving. This is without friction. But in reality, I can stop, right? So this is with friction. And similarly, in the labor market, in our actual economy, there's friction. And furthermore, similar like in physical world, right? So this friction is useful. Otherwise, I cannot walk without friction. Does that make sense? Like for example, so on the ice, so it's very difficult to walk, right? And these frictions is useful. It's keep us to have a normal life. And it's the same thing in labor market. The friction is going to be useful. That's something we all study. But for now, just keep in mind the three things you should notice. Is number three, unemployment rate. Let's just use short for U is always greater than some number. Let's just say 3%. Okay, is that clear? So there are three things. Okay, now let's go to details. Let's just look at a few definitions, help us understand the graph. We start with unemployment rate. What is unemployment rate? That's the percentage of total people in the labor force who are unemployed. Now, in order to understand this concept, we got another two concepts we need to understand. Labor force, unemployed. Okay, let's start with labor force. What is labor force? So that just says all workers employed or unemployed. Now we got unlucky. So this is kind of a circle, right? Because it's just so it seems like it doesn't tell us much. Because labor force is employed and unemployed. Unemployment rate says whoever in the labor force who are not unemployed. So it seems like we are in the bad circle. So now I'm going to draw a diagram to explain to you what this means. Maybe you this part, okay, on the bottom. So just forget about the upper part. All right. So let's just follow my drawing. So let's just start with a big circle. Okay. And where we start is the total population. Okay. So in the total population of the United States is roughly 300 million. So that's where we start, right? So now we start with these, but this is not very useful for us to start labor market. And then, so we are going to look at a smaller one. Let's just draw another one, smaller one. Okay, so that's our starting point. Instead of looking at the total population, which is 300 million, roughly, we are going to look at adults population. Okay, and furthermore, so probably here, usually we have says adults, non-institutionalized and civilian. Okay. So let me explain to you what this circle means, or who are inside, who are not, and why we do that. So essentially, we are going to exclude or the difference between this one and this one are the following. First, those who are younger than 16, because those are essentially like quote unquote children, right? So they're not legally work. Does that make sense? So we are excluding them. The number one. Number two, so we are excluding those who are military. Why we excluding that? Because that's not a good indicator about the labor market. Because for example, so if he only cares about the labor market, or if we include them in the labor market, and if we want to have a good labor market, and then simply what you can do, you just initiate war and just drop everyone in the military. Does that make sense? So that just means that's probably better to not include the military. Okay, so this is second, those are excluded. Now the third group will be excluded is those people are institutionalized. Who are considered as institutionalized? Inmates, that's perfect example, thank you. Who else? Inmates, those are not in labor force, right? So they are served in the sentence. Who else is considered institutionalized? Yes. Very close. Retired is not necessarily institutionalized. So institutionalized, to be precise, who like in the hospital, in nursing home, who lose their ability to work. All right. So those are the main categories. So this is very straightforward, right? So we shouldn't include them in our discussion. Now, if we exclude those three groups, we left roughly, this is a rough number, 210 million. We exclude young who serve in the military and who are not able to work. for some reason. Okay, and then so this is adults population. Actually, this is where we start for our discussion in terms of the labor market. Okay, so that's our starting point. Always keep that in mind. So now we reach this smaller circle. Let me erase everything. Okay, make sure you understand what is inside this small circle and who are not, right? To be precise, essentially we exclude young, military, and institutionalized. With 200, now we left with 210 million. So this is our adults population. Now our adults population, we are going to first characterize into two groups. Group number one is called labor force. Group number two is called not in labor force. Okay, let's just wait for a second. Just be patient. So I will explain to you who are not in labor force or what that means. But first, let me explain to you what is labor force. So labor force, we have two groups. One is employed. The other is called unemployed. All right. But now gets to this last part, or just last piece of the puzzle to understand. So employed is very straightforward. You have a job. Whether you like or not, you have a job. Whether it's a part-time job or full-time job, you have a job. Okay, so this is employed. But who are unemployed? So before you walk into the class, usually we say, okay, so whoever don't have a job, but that's not enough. In order to classify as unemployed, you don't have a job, that's for sure. But secondly, that's the key. Not only you don't have a job, you won't have a job. How we tell you won't have a job? So that just means you have been actively looking for a job in the past 4 weeks. And that's you classify as unemployed. You don't have a job, but you actively looking for a job during the past 4 weeks. If you don't have a job, but you have not searched for jobs during the past 5 weeks, you are not classified as unemployed. But you may wondering, where should I put this person? We call the not in labor force, meaning they are not actively engaged. But at this point, you start to wondering, isn't that there's some problem? So by looking at, try to characterize people in this way, absolutely. So that's why we have further discussion. But for now, make sure you understand. To summarize, we have this circle, but this circle exclude young, military, where institutionalized. The starting point. Now, in this circle, we have people in labor force and the people not in labor force. In labor force include employed and unemployed. And so the last piece of the puzzle is who is classified as unemployed. Whoever don't have a job, but has been actively looking for a job during the past 4 weeks. Okay, so you may wonder where this 4 weeks coming from. So that's coming from the definition. It's like a rule of thumb. All right. Okay, so that's kind of complete the picture. Now, with this in mind, we can go back to the definition and then go back to the formula, right? So unemployment rate is defined by two parts, right? So now we understand what's labor force, and we also now understand what's unemployed. This is unemployment rate. What's labor force? So include all employed and unemployed. Now, lastly, so what is labor force participation rate? Oh, by the way, you're going to see so why we need this additional measure, right? So those are the percentage of adult in labor force. So we remember how we define adults, right? So we exclude those military, we exclude those institutionalized, because that's not relevant for our question. right? So those are the definition. And then with those preparation, we have this labor force participation rate written as follows. So the adults population, and among them, how many are in labor force? Meaning either you have a job or you don't have a job, but you're actively looking for a job. As I'm going to explain to you later, this is very important. Okay. Unemployment rate. Unemployment rate is a fraction of people who are unemployed in labor force. Right? So this is a two. Okay. So the two fact, there are two measures. Now let's look at a practice question. In your country, there are 24 million people in labor force, 21.5 are employed. What is the unemployment rate? So first we need to find out the number of unemployed, right? Unemployed equal to 24. And then unemployment rate equal to, this is equal to 2.5. 2.5 divided by 24. Right? So I believe the answer is A. Now let me use these examples to highlight the importance of looking at labor force participation. All right. Let's look at this economy. Okay. So we knew there are 2.5 million people unemployed. Just imagine for some reason, as you're going to see later. So we're going to have examples to show why this happens. For some reason, among these 2.5 million people, there are 2 million feel desperate. They couldn't find a job and decide, I'm not going to try anymore. This can happen, right? So if that's the case, can anyone tell me what is going to be the unemployment rate? So let me be precise. So among these 2.5, 2 million decide I'm not looking for a job anymore. Now, under such circumstance, what is going to be the new unemployment rate? To find out first, what is the unemployment rate? Sorry, what is the number of unemployed? Half million, thank you. Very good. Now, the harder part is now, how big is the labor force? I'm sorry? Exactly. Why is 22? Is because you originally have 24. Now there are 2 people withdraw, -2. So now if you calculate this number, it's become very small, right? You see the problem. So if we only look at if we only look at unemployment rate, okay, and this happens in a very deep recession, as we're going to see later, and then people start to feel desperate. Okay, they rather play video game instead of looking for a job. Now, if we only look at unemployment rate, you're going to see it feel like, okay, so we are doing very well, but indeed, so we are doing much worse. Does it make sense? But however, if we look at a labor force participation rate, and then we immediately see something going on, right? Because the labor force participation rate is going to change from 24 divided by whatever the size, let's call it P, right? Now it's going to decrease to 22 divided by P. Does that make sense? So yes, you have decline in unemployment rate, but at the same time, you have decline in labor force participation rate. So essentially, it's like people are not engaging, right? So that's why we look at multiple variables, right? So this is summarized by here. Okay, unemployment rate is good indicator. usually, yes.
You gauge the amount of people who are actively searching for jobs, just kind of like a survey thing? Or?
Yes. Yes. In today it's very easy because you have so many platforms, right? So I don't know where you're looking for job. You're looking for a job in Indeed, or looking for a job in Monster or LinkedIn, right? So they have this data. Okay. But in the old days, right? So either way, so they're going to do survey. Exactly. So they look, they did right. So they first they just go survey, and also they may get partially also get numbers from the Social Security office, because those people who lost a job, so they just claim for insurance benefit. That's an excellent question. But certainly, so we are going to see some issues, because you may not get the precise number. But that explains why we need to take this class to understand what's going on. I mean, eventually those people who work in certain government sector, so they didn't understand the issue, right? Okay, let's back to here. Like I said, unemployment rate is important, but it only gives you a partial picture, right? So for the following reason, like, first, this is kind of what we just discussed. It's going to understate the true level of unemployment, right? It could be the case, like in the previous example shows, you may just give up, right? And then the unemployment rate doesn't tell us, okay, someone give up. So it's because some labor market is really, really terrible, right? Okay. On the other hand, it can overstate. Why? It's just because even in a very healthy labor market, it takes time for you to find the right job. I always like comparing labor market to the marriage market. So, for example, so you know someone significant others you like or you prefer set somewhere, but it's going to take time for you to find out where she is or where he is, right? The same for your jobs. So you take time for you to find out what's your passion. You take time to find out where you like to live. You take time to find out where you like to do, right? And so to have some time to find out actually it's healthy. Just imagine if the marriage market says, okay, so once you turn 18, legally you must get married, otherwise you're committing crime. Do you think so we are in a better world or worse world? I'm sorry? Is the question clear or no? So do you think so we are going to in a better world or in a worse world? If there's a law says, okay, you must get married when you turn 18. It's going to worse, right? It's because it takes time. It's the same sense. If the law says, okay, so if you don't have a job and then so you're committing crime, that's kind of things. I'm just exaggerating the statement to help you to understand. Right? So in some sense, it is necessary to have certain amount of unemployment, or there's certain fraction of unemployment is necessary because people take time to find out the job is good for them, and in terms good for the employer and good for the society, right? Okay. Now let's just further understand what are the issues by only looking at employment rate or unemployment rate or even labor force participation rate. So this is because we are going to see a few type of troubles in the labor market. First is called discouraged worker, essentially those who give up looking for job. Like I said, so you may feel this arbitrary. Like if you have been looking for a job for 4 weeks, and then you're not classified as unemployed. But anyway, so that's kind of like classified as discouraged, right? And usually this discouraged worker becomes more abundant when the recession becomes deep. Why is that? It's because you feel hopeless. Does it make sense? Okay. So the other one is marginally attached worker. So this is slightly better. So someone hasn't looking for job in past 4 weeks, but she or he has tried during past year. And they are still hanging on there, but not qualified as unemployed. It's just marginally attached. The third one is probably more common or more relevant. Okay, it's called underemployed worker. Essentially, those who prefer to work full-time, but they only get part-time or maybe 2 part-time or 3 part-time. And this is particularly relevant for the US. Okay, and for the US, there's an institutional details. So in the US, most people get insurance through employer. And there's some employer they're trying to cut the costs by offering part-time job instead of full-time job, because by law, so they require private health insurance for full-time job. And to save the cost, they may just on purpose create more part-time job. But this is not necessarily good news for employees or for whoever looking for jobs, right? Anyway, so this is what we call the underemployed. Certain these underemployed create the following 3. I can see there are 3 possible troubles or struggles for the workers. Number 1, the jobs becomes less flexible, so you need to run in from one job to the other. Number 2, the income may not be sufficient. Number 3, this is particular for US, so you may not get insurance from your employer, and that can be expensive. Right, so those are 3 things. Okay, to summarize, the unemployment rate is useful, but not enough. So we can look at this. We can look at this diagram to see the issue. So on the very bottom, this curve, the red one, is unemployment rate. Clearly, it fluctuates, and clearly it rise in recession. Okay, if you ever knew this, what happens in 2000 and 2008, and you should realize why this rise, right? Because there's 2 big recessions. Okay, now if we considering those first, we consider those discouraged worker. So this goes up. Now, if we consider margin attached, go up further. Finally, if we include part-time worker, so things getting worse and worse. And I also want you to pay attention. So the gap, when I say gap, is those things. So the gap, if you pay attention, the gap actually increase during recession. Or in other words, so those issues we just pointed out is more severe during recession. All right. Okay, now let's look at another practice questions. So according to the table, unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate. So unemployment rate, you need to find out the number of unemployed. So which equal to, so this number minus this number, right? So unemployment rate equal to 150 minus right? So this discouraged worker doesn't enter the discussion, but that is the issue. So the interim labor force participation rate, that's simpler, 150 divided by 200. Okay, so the answer is D. Okay, question? No. Next one. Which of the following individuals can be counted as unemployed? Let's go one by one. A, Darren. No, so it's not in adults population. B, a stay-at-home mom. No, she's not in labor force. C, full-time college students. No, is not looking for a job, right? D, work part-time, but I would prefer more hours. Just not, right? It's just underemployed, but still has a job. Okay, so the answer is E. Right. Now, kind of summarize what we learned in terms of measuring the labor market. Unemployment rate, this is a number closely watched by many people. Okay, even for investors, they closely watch this number. Why? Because unemployment rate is an indicator of the health of the economy. And then the health of the economy not only give us the indicator how the economy is going to move in the next stage, and also just give you the indicator what the central bank is going to do. Right? But then, so what the central bank is going to do is going to matter to the stock market. Right? So this closely watch. But from the discussion we have so far, and you should realize unemployment rate, it is important, but it's not perfect. Right? You make sure I understand. So why this is not a perfect measure? It can overestimate or overstate the problem. It can understate the problem. Right? And also that is why. So the economists or the government or the central bank, they look at some additional variables to have a more complete picture. So this including labor force participation rate. I believe we understand from the simple example. And also look at numbers of full-time jobs. So that is dealing with underemployed. Lastly, but not the least, so they also look at average wage. That is kind of tells what? The quality of jobs. Right? So if everyone have a job, but just low-paid job, is that a healthy labor market? No. If everyone not only have a job, they have a high-paid job, so that's healthy. Right? So we are going to complement the unemployment rate by looking at other dimensions, so that you have a bigger picture. Another lesson to you is in the future when you read newspapers or when you listen to politicians' speech, you should not get fooled by they say, oh, the unemployment rate drop, and then you're asking yourself or asking whoever giving the speech, what about the other dimension? Does that make sense? So don't get fooled by a single number. So usually that's what they use as a headline. So they use this number to attract your attention, but you should look at other number, right? Okay, so this graph just help us dive into the labor market even deeper. So what do we have here? We look at the population by their race and by age. And certainly, so you're going to have more complete picture. Right? I leave that for you. Okay. Okay, so this is a picture we have seen before, but now here, so there's a new phenomenon. This actually has come with 2008 financial crisis. We call the jobless recovery. This is a period when the economy is growing or returning to normal, but unfortunately, the unemployment rate still rising. Because usually, like in the past, when the economy is in expansion, like 80s or 90s, the unemployment rate declined. But in 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, so the unemployment rate were persistently high. And the economist has a new term called jobless recovery. And there were lots of research trying to understand why this happened. Okay, in your more advanced class, you may just go in detail to understand why, right? Okay. So another reason why we look at unemployment or the labor market is usually there is a negative correlation between economic growth and unemployment rate. All right. So this is from US data. Let's see, let me skip this. Sorry. Yeah, so this is so this kind of just finish this discussion of unemployment. Now let's just go to the next topic. This kind of back to the point I raised at the beginning. So in history, so the unemployment rate was never close to zero, and usually it's above, right? Now we need to understand why. Why the unemployment rate was never close to zero? Okay, so largely because some unemployment is natural, but now we need to understand what that means. Okay, so we need to classify, or we need to further categorize unemployment into different categories. So, and then we find out there are 3 types of unemployment. Now I need to explain them one by one. Okay. But before I explain to you what are those 3 different types of unemployment, let's just take a closer look at the labor market. Okay. So this is how the labor market will look like in a typical year. So the best way to understand that is, so we need to do some abstract thinking. You may think about our world like, okay, there are 3 islands. There are 3 islands in the United States. And so you are free to move from one island to the other island. And what are those 3 islands? Islands number 1, everyone who employed live in this island. Everyone who are unemployed, they are going to move this island. And everyone who decide not looking for a job, they are going to be in this island. Okay, so this is the first step. You should need to think very loud. So we just say, okay, so we just pretend there are 3 islands for us to live in the real world. Okay, so each island has certain type of person. Now let's see how they're going to move from one island to the other island. Let's start with here. So employed, they could move out, go to not in labor force. There are close to 4.2 million. And also employed, there are people move out and go to unemployed. Start with simpler one. Roughly 2 million people move from employed to unemployed. Who are they? Who are those people move from employed to unemployed? First of all, whoever lost a job. This happens every day, right? Who else? They quit. Someone want to find a better job, or someone who has passion in different industry, or someone who want to become an entrepreneur, right? But primarily, those are people who lost their job because of the business closure or because of the hiring freeze. Okay, so now who moved from employee to not in labor force? There are more than 4 million people. Retired, thank you, retired. That's a majority. People retired, or someone who get a lottery, so who decide to not work or don't need to work, right? But primarily it's retired. All right, but certainly there are a few small fraction who will decide to return to school. This particularly happened during 2008 and 2009 financial crisis. There's someone who get laid off and then they decide, okay, so maybe go to school, get an advanced degree, right? So this is the first move from employee to unemployed and then not in labor force. Now let's look at unemployed. So you have this number is closer to this one. People move from unemployed to employed. That's very simple. You gain job, right? Or you record by your company, right? So now unemployed to not in labor force, close to 1.8 million. Who are they? Unemployed and not in labor force. So essentially, those are discouraged workers primarily, right? So they have been tried for so long, and then they decide maybe I can retire earlier or I do something else. Okay, so now let's go to the lost island. Those who not in labor force. And then, so there are close to 4 million. Go back to employed, and a 1.6 go to unemployed. Who are they? Who are those? First of all, who are those 4 million people not in labor force? Who are those majority? Not in labor force, and then suddenly get job. Students, graduates, right? So that's a big chunk, right? But then, so you have people who not in labor force and becomes unemployed. So essentially, those people, they regain some traction in the labor market. They want to try again, right? So maybe some like stay-at-home mom, when their kids grow up, and then they decide, okay, so it's time to get a new job. Or even there's some retired people. So they feel, okay, so the income is not sufficient, or they get bored. Then they find a job, right? So anyway, so that's how the labor market dynamics looks like. So people just constantly moving from one island to the other island. Okay, so you just think about this like 3 islands. Okay, but this is just like in the virtual, right? So in terms of categorization, but they're still in the same place. Okay, but now so from here is ready to talk about different type of unemployment. The first one we called frictional unemployment. So it's essentially there are unemployment because it just take time for you to search for quote unquote perfect job. The reason why I say the quote unquote is usually there's no perfect job, right? But something close to perfect. And this background picture essentially tells you why there's frictional unemployment. Okay, so in reality, so there are different persons, they have different talents, they have different passion, they have different callings. Okay, but then it's going to usually take time for them to find out what is their talents and what is their passion and where is the place they can fulfill those callings, right? But then fundamentally why this happens is because of scarce information. In terms of information about yourself, in terms of information about employer. Okay, so that's a fundamental issue. Information are scarce, right? So actually we can spot the frictional unemployment by looking at the actual data. Usually the short-term unemployment largely caused by frictional unemployment. Okay, so what this graph is about? So this graph just characterize the length of unemployment. Like say, so there are 31% unemployment. It's just less than 3 months. And usually those are frictional unemployment, right? Because it takes time for you to start finding a job because you have the ability and there's job available for you. That's just for you to find and for you to relocate. Okay. Oh, sorry, less than 5 weeks, apologize. So it's not 5 to 4. Yeah. Those are frictional. Right. And the other reason, so why we look at the length, or actually it's in economics, we call the spell of unemployment. The reason why we look at that is usually the longer the unemployment, the bigger the damage. Why? Why the longer employments create more damage? What kind of damage you can think? You can think of. For certainty, you lose your income, for sure. What else? So yes. I'm sorry?
Sorry, companies.
No, here, yeah, here, we are talking about the worker. If you lose your job for, say, for example, more than half a year, what kind of long-term damage you're going to have? You're going to face, besides the income. You are going to start to lose your skills. That's a big concern. Right, so if you have been out of work for too long, you're going to lose your skill, even though when the job is available in the future, you may not qualify. But in terms of the aggregate economy, so that just means that productivity is going to drop. Does it make sense? So that's why economists also look at the spell of the unemployment. If there are many people who has been out of a job for a long time, and then the recovery is going to be very slow. Why? People is going to take time to regain the skill. Does it make sense? Okay. Now, the second type of unemployment is structural. Okay. So those unemployment is caused by some structural reason in the economy. Right? And here we have a few examples. Labor union. So essentially, the labor union is going to create a price floor. Or in other words, usually labor union trying to raise the wage. Okay, but then so this artificial higher wage is going to create surplus. Let's see, I think we have yeah, this is sorry. So this is how labor union can create structural unemployment. Right, so if without labor union, this is going to be the wage, and then there's no unemployment. If we forget about other type of unemployment. Now, labor union usually just raise the wage, right, called minimum wage. And now you're going to see there's a larger supply than demand. Okay, this is one reason. Now go back. The other reason is called efficiency wage. So efficiency wage looks similar to unions, like the minimum wage, but the reason is different. To understand that, let's go back to the graph. Just imagine we in a word here. That means there's no unemployment, right? Now just see the issue from the point of view of the employer or worker. Okay, if you know, so there's no unemployment, will you work very hard or not? Or in other words, is there any cause for you to not work hard, get fired? Not really, right? Because even though so I don't work hard, I get fired, and then next day or today immediately I get a job another place. Does that make sense? So this is without any other sense, right? So forget about the structure, forget about the friction unemployment we talk about, forget about union. They just says, okay, so if the market works perfect, now the employer are going to realize that, so they are going to find a solution. So this is actually coming from the ingenuity of the business. And what the business did is they just artificially pay you higher wage. They artificially pay a higher wage and then just artificially create unemployment. And this unemployment is going to work as a stick. So there are carrots and a stick. What is carrots? They pay you higher wage. What's a stick? If you don't work hard, you get fired. You get fired, it's going to hard to find a job because there's unemployment. So they use this efficiency wage to create incentive for you to work hard. Okay. But this type of employment is coming from some structure issue. And the structure is because so there's hard time for employer to keep you work hard. And then they create this issue. Does it make sense? Okay, so this second type, efficiency wage. But certainly there are other side effects of government policy. So examples of the government just propose a raise of minimum wage, right? Or the government says, okay, I'm going to give you more benefits. Like probably you heard about from the newspapers or online TVs. So it says 2020, the government has give us too much free checks and a lot of people don't want to work, right? That's kind of the flavor. So the government policy can lead to unemployment, right? And lastly, it could be the mismatch between employees and employers. And usually this mismatch comes during the time when there's some like technological shift, and then the demand from the employer in terms of skill is different from what the worker has, right? So this union, so I already explained to you. So let's skip these, and then we have discussed these slides already. Okay, and then so this is minimum wage is kind of government policy, right? So everything has a trade-off. So the minimum wage has an issue as we just talked about, so it can create structural unemployment. But certainly the minimum wage has its benefit. It raises the standard of living for those who live on minimum wage, right? So there's a dedicated balance for any government policy, right? Okay, so usually we classify the frictional unemployment and the structural unemployment as natural unemployment. It is natural in the sense it was coming from the fundamental frictions in the economy. Just remember, so why there's frictional unemployment? Take time for you to find out why there's structural unemployment. Okay, because of efficiency wage. Why does efficiency wage? Because the employer cannot guarantee you work hard. Then they create this efficiency wage, create this unemployment, right? So both in some sense is necessary for the economy. And that's why we put them together called natural. And if we look at the natural rate of unemployment across different countries, you're going to see a wide range of difference. And you may be wondering why it's so different. Like say in the United States here. On the far right, you have Greece, you have Spain. Okay. And the reason why there's such difference largely coming from the fundamental reason that create those frictional. Sorry, that create those natural unemployment, including frictional and structural, right? Largely because maybe the information is harder to acquire, or is because the government has too much regulation. Right, so that's expense. So why some country the natural rate of unemployment is so high? Okay. Now, before we close this part, let's look at this practice question. Jasmine has recently moved to Florida because she loves the warm climate. But now, so she needs to take a few weeks looking for a job. And then naturally she stay unemployed. What type of unemployment is this? It's frictional, right? So that's a perfect example of frictional. Okay, so I'll leave this for you to watch. So when you watch this video, just keep in mind this kind of summary. So this video is kind of summary what we discussed. So keep in mind, so the unemployment rate, that's not the perfect indicator. And in reality, you have discouraged worker, you have marginal attached worker, you have underwork. All right, so that's how you watch this video. Okay, so let's just finish this part by looking at the third group. So as I explained to you so far, so we talk about frictional and we talk about structural. And we put them together called natural. And that explains why the unemployment rate never close to zero and usually is above 3 or 4%. And this number change over time. And why this change over time essentially reflects the change of the natural economy. So if you example, in modern days, the information is easier or cheaper to acquire, right? Just imagine how you find a job today. And compare how I find my first job when I graduate from college, right? So I guess today's probably it's probably incredible for someone to hand out a hard copy of CV. Has anyone done that these days? Not really, right? So usually just send by emails or just fill online, right? But when I was out of college 30 years ago, so we need to print out a CV. And back then, so to print out a CV is not trivial things, because back then the PC and the printer is not widely available. So you can see, so to find a job is not easy, right? Okay, and then naturally there are more frictional unemployment. Okay. Okay, so there's a difference between actual unemployment and natural unemployment. And the rest we will classify as cyclical. But what is cyclical? So cyclical essentially is unemployment rate correlated with business cycle. Or in other words, is caused by the up and down of our aggregate economy. Okay. Now, this just go back to the earlier things we saw. Lower growth is usually correlated with high unemployment. We have seen that before. Or in other words, so when recession hits, unemployment rate is higher. That is on top of natural rate of unemployment. Why? Number one, when GDP falls, the firm, they cannot sell their stock or the demand is weak. And then the firm is going to start to lay off workers. You probably already hear from the news, right? Like yesterday I was hearing news. So Meta or Facebook, so they have hiring freeze. Amazon start to cut their not retail, their workers, their workplace, right? So it's because everyone was fear there's a recession coming, right? Okay, so this is one reason. So when GDP falls, demand's weak, you don't need that many workers, and then so you start to lay off, and the unemployment rate start to pick up. On top of that, so during recession, the business is not functioning in full capacity. And then their ability to generate new job will be hindered. So if you them so in a normal day, so they operate in 100%, and they are going to generate one job per year or 10 jobs per year if it's easier. Now, so if them because of recession, they only operate in half, and then naturally they can only generate 5 new jobs per year. Does that make sense? Okay, so one is like stock, the other is like a growth or flow, right? Let me write down. One is like stock, the other is flow. on the one hand, your stock is going to fall, and at the same time, your flow is going to dwindle. So this both is going to cause the unemployment rate shoot up when economies experiencing downturn, right? So this is called frictional unemployment. Finally, so we need to understand natural rate of unemployment so that we have a better sense how we're going to do the policy analysis. But what caused the change in natural rate of unemployment? Number one, changes in characteristics of labor force. For the US economy, so the biggest change is the retirement of the baby boomer generation. So that's going to change the labor market quite significantly, right? Because the newer generation or younger generation, so they may have different preference in terms of the job. Now, the second one is changing labor market institutions, right? The primary example is new technology. To make it easier to find the jobs, right? The third one, changes in government policy, right? Say, for example, if there's a job training program, so that's going to reduce the frictional unemployment. Why? Once you lose a job for some reason, and then the government programs can help you to acquire a new skill or prepare you to find a new job. Right? Okay, so let's stop here for this part. And then, so in the next, we're going to study the inflation.